as always, if you want to get the paperback, you can type !paper, and there you go, and it will pop back up. Thank you, EchoBot, for your hard work and your assistance in all the things. All right, do I have any other things, bookkeeping things that need to be done? I don't think so. Okay, so we're going to read player engagement with games, formal reliefs and representation checks, from the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism by Carl Egerton, and I apologize for how I say everyone's name. Games containing fictional narratives. Games frequently feature fictional narratives. This should be uncontroversial and is obviously, at least for certain subcategories of game. It has been noted that even a cursory observation shows that many video games do involve narratives. Clearly, in a game such as BioShock, a story is told, in this case progressing through a shipwreck, a stranding in an undersea city, various discoveries and conflicts, and a dramatic final escape. However, it takes little to recognize that another subcategory, board games, can be included within this. Consider Agricola, which presents the following introductory description. Central Europe around 1670 AD. The plague, which has raged since 1348, has finally been overcome. The civilized world is revitalized. People are upgrading and renovating their huts. Fields must be plowed, tilled, and harvested. This sets up a story to supplement the bare rules of the game. In the guise of a farmer, the player collects and spends resources, builds enclosures for animals, plows fields, grows their family, and so forth. On turn 1, they oversee 2 people in a 2-room shack, and by turn 14, they may oversee up to 5 people whose house sits on a much developed farm. There are, of course, differences in the role played by narrative between these two games. The basic narrative sequence for BioShock is, I would argue, necessary for even minimal engagement by any human player, which is not true for Agricola. A human would be simply unable to react appropriately to the tasks of BioShock without treating events in the game as something like fictional versions of, for example, exploring spaces filled with objects or fighting enemies that are launching attacks. Why is that different from a board game? I mean, you get attacked in board games. It's not like you're getting attacked in real life in board games. On the other hand, continuing, a human could complete Agricola's key tasks with only an appreciation of the bare rule set, that a resource is worth n points at the game's end is comprehensible without considering what the resource is intended to represent. Even if it is far easier for typical players to understand why condition A yields 3 points per tile while condition B yields 5 when condition A represents a wooden house and condition B represents a stone house, this is not required, and the strategically important reason for the difference in value is that condition B requires more investment of the game's finite resources. Okay, I'm just going to be like, stop right here and hold up, author. The whole point of having people make bots in games is that none of these things matter. Now, granted, it is much harder to have a bot play a complex game like BioShock than it is for, say, Tetris, because, you know, you should go hang out at my buddy SPSH Kairos stream. He currently holds the Tetris box world record. Let's see if nope, that's not what I need to do. I need to shout out Kairos. Let's see if it works. Yeah, so you should go check out Kairos, Mad Coder. And so, like, you can do that for Tetris, and Tetris is a video game. You can equally do like Mario games. There's like Mario stuff. Now, the 2D video games and puzzle games have much less complexity than BioShock, which is if you don't know, it's a 3D shooter basically, and so you're traversing a world in 3 dimensions. But it seems like this is a matter of time before we have bots do this. And if a bot can do like those other games of any sort of complexity, it can also do the board game. I'd even say it's harder to do the board game because the board game requires actually doing stuff in real life. You can't just hook a computer up to a like BioShock, you can just have another program running on the same computer and like feeding it inputs. Agricola, if that's actually a board game, you'd need a robot to do stuff. It could direct you, a bot could direct a person how to play, but that actually can't work. So I've got like a major beef with how this author has already represented the difficulty level in certain games and what actually can be done. I will grant that, but the author's question here is, then what is the value of narrative? You don't need any value of narrative. You can just have the bot play a billion games and eventually it will stumble down the right path in a BioShock. It just takes longer. That's all it is. So that's a question here. I'm not sure about, like, maybe this person just does not understand how sophisticated a bot can get. Nevertheless, Nevertheless, I would insist that the narrative perspective is at least strongly encouraged and plausibly prescribed in both games. If we do nothing beyond stacking relative values, not only are we less likely to enjoy the game, there is a significant sense in which we fail to engage with it appropriately. Board game designers take pains to design artwork, add caption text, give prompts in rulebooks, and so forth, with the intention of getting players to engage with the game's narrative aspects, and to refuse to thus engage is to depart from an integral aspect of the game. Okay. There is also the question, if you didn't know, so I'm on Twitch. I've watched a bunch of people playing games. I consider playing games myself, like sometimes on Twitch. Yes, some people hate the lore, some people like the lore. You have to realize some people couldn't care less about the story. Some people just like the gameplay. And so there's the gameplay aspect that people like. They don't care what the story is actually, but they like to play the game. And for them, the lore doesn't matter. Other people love lore. They want to read all the things. And they also like the gameplay. They like to, but they also like the lore. And they try to understand what's going on. I'm going to talk about Elden Ring because, well, I was watching a bunch of Elden Ring streams. Elden Ring, they got George R.R. Martin to write them a novella as the backstory, as I understand it, so that their world would be, compelling. Like, they got perhaps one of the best, if not the best, depending on whose opinion these things are, fantasy writers of our time to give them a world with a compelling story that they filled in with all sorts of fun stuff. So it's like, people love this stuff. And I think even if you don't care about all the lore, when you're playing it, it does matter that certain areas are pretty or it seems like there is something going on, even if you do not care as much about the lore. Okay, continuing. The fact that the medium differs between video games and board games does not entail a significant difference in the role of fictional narratives. In taking this perspective, I intend no commitment on questions of ludology versus narratology. What the heck does ludology mean? I should find that out. Where the former position insists on the primacy of rules over fiction and theorizing about games, and the latter the converse. Okay, so ludology is putting rules first. It is enough for my purposes that there are some games for which aesthetic engagement requires fictional engagement, and I confine my attention to these. While I reject the claim that fiction in games is characteristically highly subjective, optional, ambiguous, and subject to discussion, to cede this point would merely restrict the analysis to a smaller range of narrative-focused games rather than ruling it out entirely. Now, of course, there are visual novels where you're playing basically less game, but you're there for the story anyway, but you still sort of direct stuff going on. And of course, there's dating sims and all sorts of things that are much more story-driven things, where the choices you make, they're kind of like choose-your-own-adventure style games, or books, if you remember, those, where maybe you were a kid, but we had these books where you got to pick, you could make decisions and you'd have different outcomes. Well, there are video games that really make use of that, and so they're more like maybe comic books where you are much more engaged in where the story goes, and it's very complex, but it's definitely more of a storytelling experience. And I guess that would be the smaller range of narrative focused games. But there's a lot of them, and they're actually a major category on Steam. If you look at numbers by a game engine and by what people play, one of the game engines that you might not expect to be one of the top game engines is a narrative game engine. Like, it's meant for people making games that talk about like these stories that you can build into like video games. So it is a thing, and it's a bigger thing than maybe people who are only have a casual understanding of like the landscape of video games would expect. Okay. Continuing, of course, some games do not invite a fictional narrative attitude at all. When playing noughts and crosses, tic-tac-toe, we would be hard-pressed to construct any narrative beyond the mere patterns of moves, or in video game Sphere, there are clear cases such as the puzzle game 2048, which requires only the manipulation of numbered tiles, as well as cases featuring fictional characters, but no narrative, such as Nintendo's brain-training games. I could recount the story of some victory, but this would consist of little more than a list of moves. I opened top left, they responded with ... That lacks any plausibly fictional component. Indeed, there is a scale. I can construct only the vaguest fictional narrative for games like chess or Go, involving some notion of armies engaging in combat, and it would be strange to accuse the chess player who thinks of the knight just as the piece that moves, thus or failing to properly engage with the game. Narrative readings of chess are available. One might take them to be enriching, and there seem to be more and less appropriate readings. It is less appropriate to imagine the pieces as participating in a group dance, but no reading is required for proper aesthetic engagement. I guess there's no fictional reading. I mean, the pieces have names, but there's no reason why you even need to know what their names are. To probably enjoy chess. Like, why is one called a bishop and one called a rook? Like, what does a rook mean? Maybe it meant something more in the past, but I don't think you actually need to know much. Okay, continuing. I, from now on, assume that both video games and board games can encourage players to imagine them as, in part, narrative fictions of a sort, and that for some games, the fiction is not a mere gloss on the game, but is essential to the functioning of the game. That games can themselves be works of fiction, and therefore artworks, is widely accepted. And we were just talking about Win 2020 recently. On, what was that last paper? Last time I read? Forget. Recently, either last Philosophy Roulette episode or the time a week ago. Before moving on, a note on focus is in order. This article focuses on video games and board games, as they are interestingly different yet related subcategories that benefit from consideration together, and in the latter case because the category is underexplored. The case might be more easily made using tabletop role-playing games, but their relationship with fiction is so close that it is more informative to set them aside. However, in focusing on these subcategories, I do not intend to claim that they constitute a precisely philosophical interesting category. The analysis to follow is intended to apply to any game that is also a work of fiction, where this is taken to be stronger than merely having fictional content, since some games merely license fictional engagement. I take a game to be a work of fiction when it prescribes engagement with its fictional content. Or to put this another way, when full absorption in gameplay in Win's 2020 sense requires fictional engagement. I mean, this makes sense. If you are told in a game you have to walk somewhere, like in the video game, then you are fictionally walking. There is no fictional, like in a puzzle game, you're just sort of, doing the puzzle moves, but there's nothing fictional about that. Those are the moves. There is no walking in a video game, like BioShock, a 3D shooter where you walk forward and you shoot stuff. There is no shooting. You didn't hold a gun. You held a fictional gun, and in the fictional world, you fictionally shot. Well, in the fictional world, you did shoot. In the real world, you fictionally shot. You have to be actually really careful about that stuff when you're talking about fictional entities, like Santa Claus. Sorry about the spoiler on Santa Claus. Okay, yeah, so we've gotten all of 2 pages. This is what I was meaning. Like, these are small letters. Fictional reliefs and reality checks in fiction and in games. Margaret Brunvag introduces a pair of useful concepts, and I apologize, hard to say your name, Margaret. introduces a pair of fictional useful concepts for understanding how our aesthetic engagement with fiction shifts. Focusing primarily on film through literature is by no means excluded. Vogue notices that various techniques are employed by creators to enable us to continue to engage where we might otherwise experience failures of aesthetic engagement, such as the phenomenon of imaginative resistance. For instance, when watching Breaking Bad, I emotionally engaged with Walter White, a manufacturer and distributor of an immensely damaging drug who has nothing but contempt for much of humanity and furthermore murder. I would struggle to relate to a real-life counterpart, but a range of techniques bring the narrative's fictional nature to prominence, freeing me to engage extensively without feeling the need to distance myself from the character. What's funny about this example actually is I work in New York City. I know some ex-gangsters basically, and one of them was telling me once that he can't stand Breaking Bad because all the gangsters there are idiots and they're acting like they're drawing way too much attention to themselves. He said if any of the gangsters in Breaking Bad were in real life, they would be put down and kicked out of the gang immediately for being idiots and like causing too much like commotion. And so he couldn't watch this for exactly the reason that because he knows too much about the drug trade and gangs, and he was like, this is just too unrealistic. Examples might include prominent use of soundtrack, highly stylized cinematography that draws attention to unusual perspectives, or drawing the audience's attention to curious plot elements, such as the recurring pink teddy bear of Breaking Bad Season 2, where this happens, where the creators draw attention to a narrative's fictionality to affect the manner of audience engagement. We have what Vogue calls fictional relief. Okay, so yeah, you need to break the fourth wall or something, and so this is a different kind of fourth wall breaking to say, hey, look, remember, this is not actually a real world, this is a fictional world. So that's interesting. Fictional reliefs have a companion concept, the reality check. In order to drive our engagement in different directions, for example, towards considering an action's wider social impact, a fiction may employ techniques to encourage us to treat the narratives as more like a series of real events. Vogue likens our engagement in such cases to typical engagements with documentaries. And, you can always see, what's it called? In Law and Order, they would say, plot ripped from the headlines, or they used to at least. I don't know if they say that anymore, but it's like ripped from the headlines. Like, so it's trying to say, this is just like reality. To return to Breaking Bad, while people addicted to crystal meth are often presented in darkly comic ways that distract from the impact that the drug has on real users, we are sometimes brought starkly back to reality when seeing a person brutally murdered for drug money, or seeing Walt watch silently as someone dies because their death would be convenient. We are encouraged to confront circumstances much more as though they were real. We can no longer safely engage in the quiet man turned criminal mastermind fantasy, and temporarily we are expected to censure Walt as we would a real individual. Where creators portray fictional content in a way that more closely resembles nonfiction to affect audience engagement, we have a reality check. Since, as per Section 1, games can have a fictional narrative component, it seems to follow that the same techniques are available to the creators of games, but for completeness, let us confirm this. Fictional relief seems an appropriate description of various common features in video games. For instance, when blood can be switched off, violence is animated in a cartoonish way, or features of soundtrack, narration, and so forth emphasize to us that the circumstances are fictional. Reality checks can also be found at various points in video games. In BioShock, little sisters are heavily stylized under a creepy child horror trope, and thus are largely unsympathetic until their monstrous big brothers are defeated. The player is then presented with a choice between killing them or saving them, with the former generating a greater bonus. When the choice is presented, the little girl is brought into the center of the frame, her face shown to the player in high contrast as she cowers. The player is clearly intended to feel some pressure on their decision, though the reality check is not as strong as it might be, since if the player chooses the harvest option, they are spared the sight of the resulting corpse. However, we are temporarily drawn away from the more fantastical elements of the game, and at that point feel less comfortable with a degree of violence that had previously been simply accepted in the course of standard gameplay. Well, yes, but of course, killing other people in like a battle versus killing children is always there's still always a distinction there. But yeah, the point's not like is a good point. It's that I haven't played Bioshock in forever, but like, yeah, there are like scenes where you get like up close and personal with like what looks to be a little girl, and so it's like, would you, when things are farther away or stylized, yeah, you do not feel the same emotional connection as when it looks like a more like a human person. Board games are less straightforward in this respect, but let us start with fictional reliefs. We are presented especially fictionalized circumstances in various games where the real implications of our goals are problematic. For example, in the timeline-altering game Chrononauts, one player character's victory condition is to cause World War III. The goal is made comedic rather than threatening by having it assigned to Squatrant, a hyper-intelligent cockroach. It would present differently as the goal of, say, a violent nihilist. We might see another in the stylized presentation of Pandemic. Here players battle to eradicate disease outbreak that threaten the planet, but graphic depictions of illness or even descriptions of symptoms are notably absent, with the game's aesthetic much cleaner than it might conceivably have been. One of the fun things about the Pandemic games was there was a game, I think it was called Contagion, and basically your goal was not to eradicate disease. Your goal was maybe to like, infect the whole world, and people were using that to like try to model COVID-19 at the sort of like the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Maybe it was Pandemic, I don't know. It was this game that the author is mentioning, but like the developers of the game had to put on the sales page, do not be trying to actually model real life things with this game. It's not going to work correctly. But like that became a thing. They got like some huge number of sales in at the start of the pandemic, because people were having fun, being like, oh, what's going to happen in like this part of the world if COVID-19 gets there. So yeah, so the fact that like it was sort of a stylized version of epidemiological software, I'm sure played into that. Okay, are there reality checks in board games? Though they are less obvious, I think there are clear cases. Consider again Agricola. One's choices when determining how to maximize points may involve securing insufficient food to feed one's family at the harvest, upon which a starvation token, which yields negative points, is received. In service of a long-term strategy, we may do this voluntarily, but we are encouraged to see this particular points trade-off as an especially serious failing. Notably, the game's design could clearly be tweaked to make us feel either better about such decisions, for example by redescribing the same condition as a penalty for failure to pay a tithe on one's land, or worse, for example, by requiring us to remove a family member piece representing the death from starvation. Another form of reality check comes in games like Werewolf that involve group decisions to condemn player characters to death. In this case, the group must decide who among them they believe is a werewolf, as the aim of the game is to kill all the werewolves before they kill the villagers, except of course for those who players are the werewolves. This process is typically drawn out to give the greatest opportunity for guilt on the part of the accusers for treating the accused as liars and traitors. This despite, this is a board game again. This is just like an Among Us situation in the video game sense. And I mean, the fun part about Among Us is, I was going to say, could you do that in board game? No, it'd be hard to do in a board game. You can do it in the video game because people are cut off from each other. So that's an interesting mechanic there. The people are distributed, but in a board game sense, you can't do that. Okay, this despite the fact that in the context of the game, it is mandated of some of them to lie and betray, and therefore not surprising that this behavior would be suspected, even if as a matter of chance the accused was assigned an honest role. Indeed, exploiting feelings of guilt about victimization can be a good survival strategy for players, as either a villager or a werewolf. I may try to elicit sympathy for my position, pointing to the cruelty of sentencing someone to death on scant evidence beyond an intuitive sense of who is suspicious. In such games, I have both honest justly and dishonestly bemoan people's tendency to suspect me of lying, and in either case, facts about emotional states are imported from outside the game setting. We have seen in this section that games can play with perceived fictionality using fictional reliefs and reality checks, much as traditional fiction can. Neither medium elicits aesthetic engagement in a fixed manner. Further questions about the different purposes served by these features and the different ways they might manifest in narrative fiction and games will be left aside for now. Instead, we explore a feature that is analogous to fictional reliefs and reality checks, but is distinctive of games. As we will see, while their dual makeup of rules and fiction has been remarked on, it is only by appreciating how dynamic their interplay is that we can fully recognize the complexity of engagement with games. Excuse me. Now we are in a position to articulate the analogy that is this article's main concern. Games do not just play with the fictionality of our attitudes to the events represented, the involvement of rules, and the demands on a successful rule set, for example, excluding rule strategy that blatantly dominated all others, or allowing gameplay to be sustained without frustration for some salient period, may require us, if we are to sustain engagement, to temporarily suspend that fictional attitude, not by moving toward a more realistic attitude, but by moving towards a more formalistic, non-representational attitude. The task of this section is to explicate this feature through an analogy to the pair of concepts explored in section 2. Alright, I have no idea what they're saying here. Let's find out. Let us first return to board games. Agricola has within its rule set certain requirements on the acquisition and retention of animal tokens. Roughly, one must build fences to create pastures, and without a dedicated pasture for a type of animal, one cannot acquire them. Furthermore, at each harvest, animals breed, increasing their numbers. In many respects, here and in other games, there is a relation of support between the rules and the fictional content. So we're doing grind now. Yeah. Through the game's specific valorization of the possible outcomes, with points awarded and success accorded to the collection of certain tokens, the fictional status of certain players as running successful farms and others as struggling to feed their family is reinforced. In games that actively seek to create a high-pressure atmosphere, this is yet more notable. In Pandemic, one turns over cards from the infection deck to see where new outbreaks will occur, with epidemic cards marking the transition of the game to a higher difficulty. Understanding how these rules function gives the player a stronger sense of growing fictional peril. Okay, so we're talking about, this is not grind. Well, let's keep going. I'm not entirely sure what's happening here. They're saying basically that the fiction builds the tension in a sort of algorithmic manner. Now, what's that thing? It's called, I was just watching Lana Lux play it. It's definitely, it plays with the narrative. There's a game where you're stranded on a planet and you're trying to, survive. But like there's different sorts of rule sets that determine how the planet, how your gameplay is sort of like the story goes. Either is the world very punishing to you? Is the world random? Or is the world like, letting you do certain things in a certain way, and that way you have a different ability to is it Rust? Is that the game? I don't think so. It was sort of like a 2D looking game. I think Rust is 3D. I'm sorry, but like the different sorts of ways that the different sorts of rule sets in that world allow different sort of stories to be made between the players and by playing. Okay, to return to Agricola, however, two elements of the rule set demonstrate tension. First, each player may keep one animal outside the system as a pet, placed in the player's house. And second, regardless of the number of animals a player has, the stock only ever increases by one of each type per harvest. We have already observed that Agricola encourages a fictional attitude to the events within. We fictionally treat the sheep tokens as sheep, the fence tokens as fences, and the turn cycles as annual cycles punctuated by harvests where our success or failures as farmers and our family's prosperity will be determined. However, there are limits to this. Were I to engage uniformly, I would be puzzled by the suggestion that I might keep one of these animals in my house as a pet. Imagine the mess. I would also be alarmed by the failure of my breeding program to respond to scale. How would we explain the fact that whether I have 2 sheep or 8, I acquire only a single extra sheep each year? If we suppose that there was some fixed level of fictional engagement licensed by the game, it would follow that either 1, these places where representation partially breaks down are failures in the game because they aim at but do not reach that fixed level, or 2, such games do not aim at any representation beyond a level of coherence and intelligibility that allow aesthetic engagement to be unaffected by such oddities. That is, the level they aim for is fixed but low. Yeah, I was going to say that can't be right either way, but the author says, but I do not think either outcome can be correct. Against the first possibility, Agricola is well regarded as a board game, and we can appreciate why these rules are important to the game, especially the lack of skill in animal breeding. Removing this would plausibly unbalance the game. Furthermore, it is difficult to endorse this option without the consequence that simulation is the ideal for all games, which, notwithstanding, is its sheer implausibility, would have undesirable outcomes such as that board games are inherently inferior to video games. This is just wrong, though. I mean, if it's just simulation, the only simulation is real life. Everything else is an abstraction at different levels, and you can say, well, there's simulations at different levels. But yeah, I mean, clearly you can do more given bigger tools, but then everything, why don't you just go be a farmer then? So, okay. While highly realistic board games exist, for example, the notorious Campaign for North Africa, the Desert War, 1940 to 43, even these cannot approach the richness of content that is available to video games. To exclude the second possibility, we need to consider 2 options. It would follow either that the other elements in the game that depict a more coherent, more intelligible world are irrelevant to aesthetic quality, or that the game can aim to depict a world containing isolated, incoherent, or unintelligible aspects. But we can clearly see aspects of the game where this coherence is pleasing. The careful planning and building of enclosures, the increasing pressure as the harvest approaches to work the fields at the expense of other projects, are part of what makes the game engaging. If Agricola uniformly maintains such significant detachment from a coherent narrative, or if it abruptly engaged in arbitrary departures from a coherent narrative, it would fail to achieve the goals that it evidently set for itself as a game. But it does neither. Its departures are limited and targeted. Since neither consequent is plausible, we should reject the antecedent. There cannot be a fixed level of engagement in a case like this. But importantly, the variation in engagement we seek cannot be adequately explained through fictional beliefs or reality checks. Clearly, this cannot be a reality check, since appeals to features of actuality only make the situation harder to interpret. If this was a case of fictional relief, the fictional attitude would have to become stronger, yet our difficulty accommodating the situation is not merely with coherence with actuality, but also with the internal coherence of the fiction itself. Within the fiction of Agricola, it makes sense to say that fences are needed to stop the animals from escaping, and it would make sense to say that the more animals you have, the faster their numbers will grow, except that rule balancing requires us to suspend this attitude. Alright, let me see if we can get a little farther and we can figure out what the author actually wants to say here. It's like, yeah, you have to have a certain level of engagement and everything. Like, if you go to watch a movie, there are movies that could actually plausibly just be like documentaries. Like, this could be like watching someone do something. I think, I didn't see 1943 or whatever, but apparently it was as if someone had a film camera that everyone ignored, of course, was following somebody through the course of the movie. Conversely, there's something like, a superhero movie, which is plausibly nothing like reality, because they have like a superhero history that does not exist in our world, and so what? That's fine. But like, the question is, like, you have to sort of accept that world at the get-go. And so the idea that like there's reality checks and like fictional relief, like, this is way too binary. So, okay, it It is to account for this aspect of games that, analogous to fictional relief, we should introduce the concept of formal relief. This occurs where the formal or rule-centric elements of the game take precedence, and we are accordingly licensed to suspend or weaken our representational engagement with the game. In other words, where creators intentionally draw our attention to a game's rules to affect player engagement, this is formal relief. Alright. I already don't quite agree with how this is stated, but I think they have a good point here. We're going to creators intentionally draw attention to a game's rules to affect a player's engagement. And this is formal relief. This is the crux of the whole paper right here. Boom. This is why they wrote the paper, because they wanted this definition. When you are involved in a movie, in a game, in a fiction, you have to suspend your degree. The author or the creator has to get you to ignore all the other things except exactly what they want you to do and to engage with, which is the content they really want. And so the engagement has to be what the amount of effort and work they have to put in, so that they can highlight that. And that's basically that's the payoff, is that there is some sort of thing that they want you to have an experience of, and that's what the engagement is. So player engagement is what they want. What kind of engagement? Okay, continuing. To demonstrate that this feature is not particular to the board game format, I now pause again to consider video games. A widespread instance of formal relief here, I would suggest, is found in the tutorials that form an important part of many video games. In order that first-time players should be able to complete the complex tasks required of them in the game proper, many games must provide some sort of tutorial for gaining general understanding of game mechanics, such as the extent and type of motion possible. Some games, especially strategy games or those that consist of isolated, repeatable chapters, may have a tutorial situated within a simplified model of the game that allows for a demonstration of certain features, which therefore does not interfere with the game's narrative. However, it is not uncommon for a tutorial to be built into the game itself, either in a single segment forming the start of gameplay or in smaller segments distributed throughout. Such sections frequently break the fourth wall, with non-player characters instructing the player character on which commands to enter, and even if this is not done explicitly, the player will likely be asked to do quite arbitrary things in order to test commands. Once again, situating these straightforwardly within the narrative would damage the game's narrative smoothness, but we accept these departures as part of what it is to enjoy the game. Note that this does not say that a tutorial cannot be an aesthetic flaw. Tutorials can be realized more or less effectively. However, the success of a tutorial does not simply track its coherence within the narrative. I was actually wondering if they were going to do a Zelda game. There are instances of very well integrated tutorials, such as Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, but many successful tutorials involve far more artifice, such as Fallout 3, in which, among other things, the player completes a test whose answers determine the character's starting stats. Furthermore, a tutorial can be well integrated within the narrative and yet be a bad tutorial, often because it makes it very difficult for the player to figure out how to do what they want. I mean, old video games, if you've played old video games, they don't tell you stuff. You might have to get a guide book to read how to actually play the game. Then people realized that people want to play the game, they don't want to read a book. If they want to read a book, they'd go read a book. So they somehow built it in, and then they forced you to read the book via tutorial in the game, and then you knew what to do. And then later they said, all right, then they gave you a simplified sort of work, and this is sort of the development of the integrated tutorial or the integrated information, like the backstory that you had to do to play a game. And so many games now, this is how you start off, is you play a little bit and there's on-screen prompts. And as the author says, there's a variety of how well they're done versus not well done. Okay. Another example is seen in mini-games, where creators place another game within the game for the sake of player enjoyment. Sometimes these are plausible within the game structure. For instance, it could be represented that as a game played between characters in the world, as in the card game Triple Triad in Final Fantasy VIII. Even these often stretch the bounds of plausibility. The Final Fantasy VIII player is encouraged to play the minigame even when ostensibly they are locked in a desperate struggle to save the world, and the minigame displays puzzling metafictional features by including key characters as high-value cards, despite this perspective presumably being alien to the fictional world, since the characters do not know they are in a game. However, there are many examples that are hard to treat as representing genuine aspects of any world. Returning to BioShock, the means of hacking machines in the game requires the completion of an against-the-clock tile-based puzzle game. It would be patently ridiculous to imagine the character completing any such puzzle within the game world in order to shut down security devices or unlock containers. This can be contrasted with the means of unlocking chests for example, Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, which clearly fictionally represents lock-picking. Yeah, I mean, it's a pipes game in BioShock, and you have to like do a little lock-picking in these other ones. The question is, tutorials, like, what's the author's point here? Formal relief to get the player to have a certain sort of experience. Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of a relief in the sense of you're dropping complexity at these points. The game is less complex. These puzzles are less complex, like the lock-picking puzzles, the hacking in BioShock. The question is, BioShock's an intense game. Some of these games are very intense, and so having mini games that are in some sense more simplistic but still fun does break up the intensity of the game, and so that's something to think about. What kind of experience are you going for in the gameplay? You might need to actually pull the player out, and this is, instead of the fictional relief, what they're doing here is you're giving a different kind of gameplay as a relief. Now, is this formal relief? I don't know if that's exactly what the author was saying above. This is a different, like, it's not game's rules. This is sort of the game world. You're pulling someone out of it, and not in the fictional relief way, but in the sort of the interactive engagement way. You're getting a different kind of engagement. Okay. Are both tutorials and minigames either inherent weaknesses in the game or features that set the game's representational standard? No. Tutorials enhance enhance enjoyment when designed well by smoothly improving the first-time player's grasp of how to play the game, and for more unorthodox games are necessary to enable any play. For minigames, it is even clearer since they are almost by definition unnecessary for gameplay, so it would otherwise be mysterious why creators would ever include them. These features in a video game provide formal relief by dint of being recognizable departures from the fictional aspect of the game, licensing greater focus on the challenge aspect of the game. Just like as Vaug notes, genre conventions establish certain events as fictional relief, for example, the inspiring comeback from a pummeling in a martial arts film, or the chance meeting in a romance film. Genre conventions within games establish norms around formal reliefs. In the right context, these render questions like what is happening in the game world now misguided. That's fair. So they're calling this a sort of a trope relief, because you're appealing to a trope in some sense, or like this genre conventions. It is important to note that the general prospect of tension between rules and fictional content has been previously discussed. For instance, Grant Tavenor disagrees on the above point, saying that instead that unrealistic fictions are part of the baggage that we must leave at the door when we enter the fictional world to play a game. If this is intended to suggest that any such baggage is simply a flaw that we must tolerate, it undersells the potential of games, as I have tried to show. Tavenor elsewhere suggests that perhaps we must quarantine the gameplay fiction from the narrative fiction, but does not say any more about the conditions under which this happens, so the current article can be seen as clarifying and expanding on this idea. Another prominent strand of investigation is the discussion of ludonarrative dissonance, first discussed in a game critique by Clint Hawking. However, this is largely understood as a mistake in games and the tension between the viewpoint expressed by a game's fictional content and that implied by the kind of gameplay it encourages. It involves a broader concept of a game's overall message than is required here. So maybe this is kind of what I was saying not I didn't call it a mistake, but there's a there's a difference between the fictional content and the kind of gameplay. So actually, I'm not so sure what this is. I'd have to look at that. Elsewhere, Jesper Juhl discusses so-called incoherent game worlds with reference to features like point scores and having multiple lives, but there are two respects in which this treatment does not resolve the current issue. First, the notion of incoherence Juhl appeals to seems too strong, since it misleadingly suggests that we are being asked to imagine something that is unimaginable or contradictory. Games rarely seem to feature genuine contradictions, and we could usually offer some interpretation of what is going on. Second, Juhl's resolution of such conflicts is that rules trump fiction, which might work because Jules focuses on what is true in the game, as observed in the above-mentioned critique, but this does not help us understand how such matters affect aesthetic engagement. You see, I'm still... Let's see, this keeps going. Alright, we're almost done, but I'm still a little worried about this. I feel like the author has got a good point here in terms of saying, look, some video games have you sort of go into the like a sort of a formal mode, and there's different formal modes based on rules, and that is kind of how the engagement goes. But they're not saying what's good about the formal stuff. They're just saying that's like part of the gameplay. But what is that? What's the aesthetic engagement? How does that relate to the aesthetic engagement? I'm still not sure. And that's why I was saying, look, there's something the experience that the creator is attempting to make for the players has to have some aesthetic content there. Okay, continuing. By exploring the analogy to fictional relief, however, we are better to recognize the complexity of the relationship between rules and fiction. This aspect of our engagement is dynamic and limited. Our greater focus on the rules is temporary, allowing us to return to engaging with richly articulated fictional content once the rules cease to make demands on us, and we can go only so far before we lose our ability to engage with the game as fiction. Just as constant, unprincipled flights of fancy would break the limits of fictional relief by divorcing representation so far from our actual judgments as to undermine interest entirely, beyond the limits of formal relief, the player will cease seeing the represented content as at all important to the game, leaving their playing experience something akin to graphically complex draughts. And, draughts is X's and O's again. Checkers. Excuse me. Yeah, so they're saying, look, this is an escape from the fiction, but in a different way. We might expect that if fictional relief have an analog in formal reliefs, there ought to also be an analog for reality checks. I contend that this is exactly right. Well, I should hope so. You're writing this paper. If games can drive us away from treating something representationally, they can also drive us toward treating it representationally. This is common sense, since otherwise we would have to believe either that something inherent tempering force keeps us from seeing games as representational, or that games are constantly prone to collapse into being experienced formalistically. However, we can also do better and show this by example. When are we encouraged to foreground the representational aspect of board games? Some earlier examples can serve us in this respect. Recall the presence of starvation tokens in Agricola. These might function as minor reality checks, but even without ceasing to engage with the gameplay as a fiction, players can be expected to shy away from starvation tokens to a degree that outstrips their impact on points. The goal of the player may be to accumulate points, but the goal of the character the player represents in the game is to survive and hopefully thrive in a world of subsistence farming, and for that character, failing to feed their family is a greater failure than failing to farm any pigs. Even if a player chooses this option, should they go on to win, this win will likely be characterized by the players as the work of a ruthless soul committed to success at any cost. There are also more explicit instances where we are encouraged to make decisions less as players and more as characters. In a game like Dead of Winter, for example, different player characters are portrayed differently, and it is expected for players to reflect the character's nature by taking actions simply because they seem fitting to the character. This is especially true where there are multiple routes to success. A game's creators may encourage this kind of behavior weakly by using backstory, token style, or something else cosmetic, or strongly by providing rules that incentivize actions that fit with the depictions of the character. Or this is encouraged where creators portray content in a way that draws attention to the game's fictional elements to affect player engagement. We will find what I call representation checks. I mean, yeah, like, you can definitely get character-driven games, board games, and in video games by, asking what choice do you want to do? There's, of course, dating games. Who do you want to date? Or who does this character want to date? Or who do you want to, what sort of choice in a world that it doesn't really matter, it just changes the outcome of the story, and so you have a different story based on your, choices. What's it called? Detroit Becoming Human. I was watching that being played on my man the Waltiverse, who is sadly taking a break from streaming because he's an actor and he got acting gigs. Now that the Waltiverse, I think that's how no, I misspelled it. See if that's better. It is not better. That's annoying. Okay, but anyway, he was playing, and you could see, what choices do you make in that game? And at the end of certain levels, it will show you the tree and all the different possibilities that you could have chosen and where you ended up. And so, what kind of person are you that this is where it, so the idea that, you're going to a certain destination, yeah, if you knew the end of the game, you could get yourself going towards the let's try one more time. I'm a little bit concerned. Why does this not go? Or did things fall apart again? It's alright. My shout out. Oh, you want to know why? Because I'm an idiot. I'm not doing shout out, I'm just putting people's names. And there we go. Look at that dapper gentleman. That's Walt Walters, the most dapper late night Twitch host on Twitch. But yeah, so in a game like Detroit Become Human, the whole point of the game is to continue the story, and there might be different outcomes you might try to get to, but that's not the point. At least not for the first playthrough. Okay, so it's who are you going to be? What kind of person are you going to become? In the sense that, because it's becoming human, you're actually a robot, an android, and then you sort of make decisions and decide what kind of human you're becoming. And so this is exactly the idea that you are taking on different sorts of fictional elements. Okay. Representation checks occur in more obvious ways in video games. Okay, let's see if we got Baldur's Gate. Okay. The precise mechanics of games are in many cases opaque to a player, either because of the disconnect between the command as input by the player and its implementation with the game's engine, or in a more basic way because a human cannot in real time compute and understand precisely what will happen. In Baldur's Gate, a player can, in theory, consult most of the dice-based mechanics to which the game system roughly corresponds and determine that they have, say, a 35% chance of damaging a particular enemy, though they are not encouraged to do so except perhaps in high-stakes scenarios, whereas when entering the command to shoot at a goal in FIFA 19, the complex rules regarding outcome are not made available to the player at all except by broad inference. And generally, when we are encouraged to take a decision with consequences especially difficult to access in the circumstances, this functions as a representation check. We are invited to take action based not on the player's strategy for the game, but on the character's goal in the game. This is especially common in games with a role-playing element. The player may be presented with options in dialogue whose impact on gameplay is entirely opaque. The player who consults a walkthrough whenever presented with such a choice could plausibly be described as failing to engage fully or as intended, especially in games like The Banner Saga, which follows the desperate attempts at survival of a whole caravan of characters against an apocalyptic threat and presents so many choices in dialogue that frequent checking would substantially undermine gameplay. A comparison might be made with the controversy within the gaming community of using cheats to beat games designed to be very difficult, or looking up maps for games that exclude these intentionally. Here, concerns are typically less with rule breaking or norm breaking, since outside of tournaments, little consequence hangs on the choice, and more with experiencing the kind of engagement intended by the game's creators. Alright, so yes, I was wondering if speedrunning was going to come up. Speedrunning, where you use every hack, break, or whatever, not hacks in some sense, you're not affecting the game in the sense of hack. You're using every backdoor built into the game possible to go as fast as possible. You are definitely not playing the game in the intended way. But you are playing the game given the rule sets that are available to you. So you are not doing something that is in some sense playing the game, but you are using it as solely the rule set. And that's exactly what happens on Twitch when you watch these amazing speedrunners that can just blow through games that might take the rest of us hours and hours, and they do it in 5 minutes because they know every little possible way to get beyond what we're thinking here. And there's some other point here. I mean, I feel like the author missed a few things about video games. They clearly, I don't know as much about board games, but there's Easter eggs in video games, and there are Easter eggs in other places too. But Easter eggs are exactly the breaking the fourth wall when you get to a spot in the game and it does something that so even if it's a completely narratively locked game, it doesn't do any of these mini games, it doesn't do anything that's not usual. Sometimes there are still Easter eggs that you have to specifically go out and find. So you're already breaking the narrative by doing something you're not supposed to in the game, and that will actually, and then you find the Easter egg, which it has something that has nothing to do with the game, and that would be the fictional break. What was that called? I've completely lost the name. So it's not the representation check, it's the fictional relief. And that's the fictional relief. It is, I guess, a kind of formal relief, but it's really a fictional relief. Okay. Where was I? Okay, yeah. So I just wanted to mention that before I forgot. Conclusion. This article began by indicating the relevance of narratives to a wide range of games and applying this to a direct analogy between fictional reliefs and reality checks in narrative fiction and in games. This led to the recognition of an additional way in which our engagement with games can be influenced. Formal reliefs license us to suspend consideration of the game world, for instance, to engage with actions and events as strategies, whereas representation checks license us to reduce our focus on game mechanics and to see actions and events as though they are entirely part of a fictional world, not conditioned by game status. These features allow us to build the tension observed in accounts like Jewel and Tavanor, and to reach a more fine-grained and dynamic appreciation of the relationship between rules and fiction. We have not here gone as far as to explore, except through example and indication of the role of genre conventions, what techniques are employed by creators to signal formal reliefs and representation checks, further work to examine these to flesh the concepts out in line with the explication of the analogs as presented by Vague would be valuable, nor has been part of our aim here to speculate on how these different mechanisms of varying player engagement balance against one another, but by recognizing these additional kinds of variation in engagement, we open up the possibility of further exploration of their finer detail and dynamics. For instance, the exploration of aesthetics and agency in games in Win 2020 may help to sharpen our understanding of when formal reliefs work, when they contribute to an aesthetically valuable exercise of agency. Furthermore, the recognition of the important complexities that rules can introduce to engagement opens up the possibility of assessing other kinds of fictional work for rule-based influences. Regardless, however, of this exploration has demonstrated that there is much to be gained from considering how the different components of complex categories like games interact. Okay, this is a little bit of a fun paper. Yeah. This is definitely true, and the dynamics of any fictional work. Now, things that can pull you into the work and pull you out of the work. So I think we were talking earlier, TV shows, you can say ripped from the headlines and, police dramas, and then other things are meant to, just be completely fanciful. and have nothing to do with our reality. And so, or very little to do with contemporary reality. So this just put it into the video game sense, and then moreover, added the extra concept in a formal relief to get you out of the, I don't love this, actually. I mean, I like the paper, but I don't love the way it was represented here. I think they missed something in what exactly the benefit of games are, in some sense. Where was that? I guess the definition here. Creators intentionally draw attention to a game's rules to affect player engagement. This is formal relief. No, they're changing the kind of player engagement to give you a different kind of engagement that is like, so a game has, the main gameplay is this kind of engagement, and then like you draw attention to the game's rules to have a different kind of engagement. So it's like you put a puzzle game in a narrative story, like in the BioShock case, to break up the player engagement of a certain kind. And so I feel like this author is like, yes, the fictional relief gives you a break from the fiction, but the formal relief is not giving you a break from the fiction. They're giving you a break from the kind of engagement that the game is providing you. And so I feel like there's a slight misstep here in this paper. Like, I agree with basically everything they're saying. I think they're just right. They're not quite getting the, especially in video games. The reason you have like the mini games in the video game and like embedded in a larger video game is to get you away from the repetitiveness of certain games. The core mechanic in most of these games gets extremely repetitive, because if you're going to be playing the game over and over and over, you need to like change up what's going on, because you're going to get hand cramps and you're going to get like tired of the same thing over and over. So it's not just that like the fiction needs to be broken or the narrative needs to be broken. The aesthetic experience needs to be switched up, because grinding is a hard thing to do for most people over and over, because when it becomes a grind, I'm a Diablo 2 fan, ARPG, you're going to get hand cramps doing the exact same thing over and over, and I like to just sink into it and do it. But you need in most other games to like switch it up a bit to get you out of not the fiction but of the grind that the gameplay leads to, because you can't just have the same sort of like gameplay over and over and over. That will bore people out. Now, of course, very sophisticated games like I was talking about Elden Ring, you are constantly learning, you're playing the same sort of gameplay, but you're constantly learning new patterns, and you have to learn the pattern to beat the next boss. And then you have like all the people, the minor people in between, where you get to like practice your patterns and you get better and faster at this. But then you have to, when you get to the big boss, then you have to like learn different patterns. And so this is a more sophisticated structure on the formal gameplay than what's happening here. It's not just that you have a formal relief. You're always within the fiction of Elden Ring. There's no reality checks as far as I can tell in the game. I mean, just you died is the biggest one. It's like, well, okay, and then you just like you reload. But the way that you get away from that is you're riding your horse around in Elden Ring, and so you can go look at stuff. It's a gorgeous game. You can go look at stuff, you can ride your horse around, which is a different sort of gameplay, and that sort of difference in engagement, where you're, instead of like, in some sort of complex battle where you have to do different sort of sophisticated series of strikes and dodges, then you get to just like go run around in a cool, gorgeous world. This really, that is what the formal relief is here, that you get to break up the kind of aesthetic experience the person's having. And it's not that you're breaking up the fiction, you're breaking up of the game, the level of like how like different from reality it is. Getting pulled into it with the representation checks, but or the fiction, but you have to get pulled in and out of the different mechanisms in the game, because otherwise you will just it will get repetitive. And so I feel like this paper missed the aesthetics of the game, the unique aesthetics of the. See, it's not the game's fictional elements that affect player engagement. It's also the game's mechanisms that affect player engagement. And there was no talk about game mechanisms here, in some sense, as an aesthetic concern. Like what sort of things do the player have to do, not fictionally, but in some sense strategically, that they have to learn, like the strategies within it. And yeah. And that's not merely just, like, as they were saying, like knowing the percentages in FIFA. That's not it. Like, you can know the percentages in, like, different games, like 35% chance of that this thing will work. No, like, do you know the sequences of pushing certain buttons, certain moves, and when that will work within the game? And that's a different thing. Okay, so I think that's it for this paper.